So this happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. My wife Lisa basically told me she needed her freedom and wanted out of our marriage. I thought we were just going through a rough patch, you know? But then I got served divorce papers at work in front of all my students. The thing is, when I actually read through what her lawyer was demanding, I realized she had no idea what she was legally entitled to. Turns out wanting your freedom is one thing, but understanding community property laws is completely different. Her whole plan to take half of everything and leave me with the bills totally backfired when my lawyer showed me what the law actually says about our situation. So I'm Mark, 34M, teacher. I teach high school history at Lincoln High and honestly love my job. The kids keep me on my toes, and I've always felt like I was making a difference, you know? I've been married to Lisa for about 8 years now. She's 31 and works part-time at a boutique downtown. We met in college, and things were pretty good for most of our marriage. We bought a house about 5 years ago in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's ours. Well, it was ours. Lisa always seemed happy enough with our life. We'd go out on weekends, take little trips, the usual married couple stuff. Sure, we had our arguments like everyone does, but I never thought we were heading toward divorce territory. Looking back now, I can see there were signs something was off. She started going out more with her girlfriends, staying later at work even though it was just part-time. She'd be on her phone constantly, always texting someone. When I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd just say it was work stuff or her sister. I trusted her completely, so I never pushed it. I guess I was pretty naive about the whole thing. I thought marriage was about working through problems together, not just bailing when things got a little tough. But Lisa apparently had different ideas about what our relationship meant. The whole situation caught me completely off guard, and honestly, I'm still processing how everything went so wrong so fast. I was grading papers in our living room on a Tuesday night when Lisa came home from work looking different somehow. She had this weird energy about her, like she was nervous but also determined about something. I asked her how her day went, and she just shrugged and said it was fine. She sat down across from me instead of next to me on the couch like she usually did. That should have been my first clue something was up. She kept fidgeting with her wedding ring, spinning it around her finger over and over. I put down my red pen and asked if everything was okay. Lisa looked at me for a long moment and then told me she'd been thinking a lot about our marriage lately. She said she felt like she was losing herself in our relationship and that she needed space to figure out who she really was. I was confused because we'd never really talked about anything like this before. I asked her what she meant by losing herself. She explained that she felt trapped in our routine and that she needed her freedom to explore other possibilities in life. I tried to understand what she was saying, but it felt like she was speaking in code. I suggested we could take a vacation or maybe try couples counseling if she was feeling stuck. But Lisa shook her head and told me it was more serious than that. She said she'd already talked to some people about her options and that she thought we should separate for a while. The way she said it made it sound like she'd already made up her mind without including me in the decision. I felt this sinking feeling in my stomach. I asked her if there was someone else, and she got defensive immediately. She insisted it wasn't about another person. It was about her needing to find herself. She kept using phrases like personal growth and self-discovery, which honestly sounded like something she'd read in a self-help book. I tried to stay calm and asked her what kind of separation she was thinking about. Would she move in with her sister temporarily? Would we set some ground rules about dating other people? But Lisa got vague again and said she hadn't worked out all the details yet. The whole conversation felt surreal. Here was my wife of 8 years telling me she needed freedom, but she couldn't even explain what that meant practically. I suggested we sleep on it and talk more in the morning when we were both less emotional. Lisa agreed, but I could tell she was already mentally checked out of the conversation. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the little changes I'd noticed in her behavior over the past few months. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd started dressing differently. I wondered if I'd been blind to problems in our marriage that were obvious to everyone else. The next few days were incredibly awkward. Lisa started sleeping in the guest room without even discussing it with me. She'd leave for work earlier than usual and come home later, sometimes not until after I'd already eaten dinner alone. When she was home, she'd spend most of her time on her phone or laptop, barely acknowledging my presence. I tried to give her the space she said she needed while still being available if she wanted to talk. But every attempt at conversation felt forced and uncomfortable. She'd give me one-word answers or change the subject whenever I brought up our relationship. On Friday night, I suggested we order pizza and watch a movie together like we used to do. Lisa told me she already had plans to go out with her girlfriends. I asked which friends, and she mentioned some names I didn't recognize. When I said I'd never heard of these people before, she got irritated and said I didn't know all of her friends. That weekend, Lisa was gone most of Saturday and all day Sunday. She said she was having lunch with her sister, then shopping, then dinner with those same mysterious friends. I spent the time doing yard work and trying not to think about what was happening to my marriage. I started paying more attention to her social media activity, which I'd never really done before. Lisa had always been pretty active on Instagram and Facebook, but lately her posts seemed different. She was posting more pictures of herself alone, using captions about independence and new beginnings. There were photos from restaurants and bars I'd never been to with her. The comments on her posts were mostly from people I didn't know, and some of them seemed pretty flirty. One guy named Derek kept liking everything she posted and leaving comments with heart emojis. When I asked Lisa about him, she said he was just someone from work, but she'd never mentioned anyone named Derek before. I found myself checking her social media obsessively, looking for clues about what was really going on. I felt pathetic doing it, but I needed to understand what was happening to my wife and my marriage. The woman posting these photos and captions didn't seem like the Lisa I'd been married to for 8 years. One night, I tried to bring up counseling again, suggesting we could work on whatever problems she was having with our relationship. But Lisa told me she didn't think counseling would help because the problem wasn't something that could be fixed. She said she just needed to be free to make her own choices without having to consider how they affected me. I asked her what that meant for our marriage, and she said she didn't know yet. She was still figuring things out. The uncertainty was killing me, but I didn't want to push her away by being too demanding about answers she clearly didn't have. The following Tuesday, I was in the middle of teaching my third-period American history class when there was a knock on my classroom door. The school secretary came in with an apologetic look and handed me an envelope, saying someone had delivered it and that it required my immediate attention. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway to open it. Inside were official-looking documents with a law firm's letterhead. My hands were actually shaking as I read the first page, which clearly stated that Lisa had filed for divorce and was requesting immediate separation of assets. I had to lean against the wall for a minute to process what I was reading. My wife had filed for divorce without even telling me she was considering it. While I'd been trying to give her space to figure things out, she'd been meeting with lawyers and planning our separation behind my back. The papers detailed her demands, which were pretty extensive. She wanted half of our house's value, half of my retirement savings, spousal support for 2 years, and she wanted to keep her car while I continued making the payments. She was also requesting that I cover all of her legal fees for the divorce proceedings. What really got to me was reading her statement about why she was seeking divorce. She claimed I had been controlling and emotionally distant throughout our marriage. She said I had prevented her from pursuing her own interests and career goals. None of this matched my understanding of our relationship at all. I managed to get through the rest of my classes that day, but I was completely distracted. During my planning period, I called Lisa to ask her about the papers. She answered on the 4th ring and sounded surprised that I was calling. When I told her I'd received the divorce papers, there was a long pause. She finally said she'd been meaning to tell me but hadn't found the right time. I asked her why she hadn't mentioned she was already talking to lawyers when we had our conversation about separation. Lisa got defensive and said she needed to protect herself legally. I tried to stay calm and asked if we could meet somewhere to discuss this properly. But she said her lawyer had advised her not to have any detailed conversations with me about the divorce without legal representation present. It felt like she was treating me like an enemy instead of her husband of 8 years. That evening, I read through all the paperwork more carefully. Some of her demands seemed completely unreasonable to me, especially considering she'd only worked part-time throughout most of our marriage, and I'd been the primary breadwinner. I started to wonder if she really understood what she was asking for, or if her lawyer was just throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. I realized I needed to get my own lawyer immediately. This wasn't going to be the amicable separation I'd hoped we could work out between ourselves. I decided to try talking to Lisa one more time before getting lawyers involved. She'd been staying at her sister's place since serving me the papers, but she came by the house Wednesday evening to pick up more of her clothes. I asked if we could sit down and have an honest conversation about what was happening. Lisa seemed reluctant, but agreed to talk for a few minutes. She sat on the edge of the couch, like she was ready to leave at any moment. I told her I was confused by some of the things in her divorce filing, especially the part about me being controlling. I asked her to help me understand what I'd done to make her feel that way. She started listing off complaints I'd never heard before. She said I always made decisions about our social plans without consulting her. She claimed I discouraged her from going back to school or finding a better job. She said I was jealous when she spent time with her friends and that I made her feel guilty for wanting independence. I was honestly shocked by these accusations. I tried to respond to each one, explaining that I'd always encouraged her to pursue whatever made her happy. When she wanted to take art classes a few years ago, I'd been the one who found the community college program and offered to pay for it. When she decided not to continue, that was her choice. But Lisa interrupted me and said that was exactly what she was talking about. She claimed I always had to be the one offering solutions or making things happen for her, which made her feel like a child instead of an equal partner. I told her I was just trying to be supportive, but she said it felt patronizing. The conversation got more heated when I brought up the financial demands in the divorce papers. I asked her how she expected me to pay spousal support and half the house value on a teacher's salary while still covering my own living expenses. Lisa said that wasn't her problem to figure out and that I should have thought about that before being such a controlling husband. I asked her about Derek, the guy who'd been commenting on all her social media posts. Lisa's face went red, and she accused me of spying on her online. She said this was another example of my controlling behavior and that she didn't have to explain her friendships to me anymore. When I pressed her about whether she was seeing someone else, Lisa stood up and said she didn't owe me any explanations about her personal life. She said we were separated now and she could do whatever she wanted. The way she said it made it pretty clear that she was already involved with someone else, even if she wouldn't admit it directly. She grabbed her suitcase and headed for the door. I followed her and asked if this was really how she wanted to end 8 years of marriage, with lawyers and accusations instead of trying to work things out. Lisa turned around and told me that our marriage had been over for a long time. I just hadn't been paying attention. After she left, I sat in our empty house feeling completely lost. The woman I'd just talked to didn't seem like the person I'd married at all. By Friday, I'd made an appointment with a divorce attorney that one of my colleagues had recommended. The law office was in a downtown building I'd driven past hundreds of times, but never had reason to enter. The lawyer, Janet Morrison, was probably in her 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude that I found reassuring. I brought all the paperwork Lisa had served me with and explained the situation as objectively as I could. Janet listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she asked me several questions about our finances, how long we'd been married, and whether I had any evidence of Lisa's relationship with this Derek person. Janet reviewed Lisa's demands carefully and then looked up at me with a slight smile. She told me that Lisa's lawyer had made some significant miscalculations about what she was entitled to under state law. Since we'd only been married 8 years and Lisa had worked part-time for most of that period, her claim for long-term spousal support was questionable. More importantly, Janet explained that since I'd brought most of the assets into the marriage and had been the primary breadwinner throughout, Lisa's demand for half of everything wasn't automatically guaranteed. The house had been purchased with money I'd saved before we got married, and my retirement account had substantial premarital contributions that would be considered separate property. Janet also pointed out that if Lisa was already in a relationship with someone else, as her social media activity seemed to suggest, that could affect any spousal support claims. She asked if I'd be willing to hire a private investigator to document Lisa's relationship status, but I told her that felt too invasive and vindictive. We discussed my options for responding to the divorce filing. Janet recommended filing a counterpetition that would present a more realistic division of assets based on actual state law rather than Lisa's wishful thinking. She estimated that Lisa would probably end up with significantly less than she was demanding, especially if we could prove she'd been unfaithful during the marriage. The legal fees were going to be expensive, but Janet assured me that Lisa's demand that I pay her attorney costs was completely unreasonable given the circumstances. She said we could request that Lisa pay her own legal fees, and possibly mine too if her claims were found to be frivolous. I left the meeting feeling more confident about my situation, but also sad that it had come to this. I'd gone into marriage thinking it was a partnership where we'd work through problems together. Instead, I was learning about asset division and spousal support calculations like I was planning a business transaction. That weekend, I spent time going through our financial records and gathering documentation Janet had requested. It was depressing to reduce 8 years of marriage to bank statements and property deeds, but I needed to protect myself legally since Lisa had made it clear she wasn't interested in being fair or reasonable about our separation. The following week, I filed my counterpetition with Janet's help. Unlike Lisa's demands, our response was based on actual legal precedent and state law regarding property division in marriages of our length. We requested that premarital assets remain separate property and that spousal support be limited to a reasonable amount for a maximum of 2 years. Lisa must have received the papers on Wednesday because she called me that evening and she was furious. She accused me of trying to leave her with nothing and said I was being vindictive by challenging her reasonable requests. I tried to explain that I was just responding to her legal demands with equally valid legal arguments, but she wasn't interested in hearing my perspective. She said her lawyer had told her she was entitled to half of everything we'd acquired during the marriage, and she couldn't understand why I was being so selfish about it. I asked her if her lawyer had explained that entitlement laws were more complicated than just splitting everything 50-50, but Lisa said I was trying to confuse her with legal technicalities. The conversation got worse when she brought up the private investigator issue. Apparently, her lawyer had warned her that I might try to have her followed to prove adultery. Lisa was outraged that I would even consider such a thing and said it proved how controlling and paranoid I really was. I told her I'd actually decided against hiring an investigator because I didn't want our divorce to get that ugly. But Lisa said the fact that I'd even discussed it with my lawyer showed my true character. She accused me of trying to destroy her reputation and make her look bad in court. When I asked her directly if she was seeing Derek or anyone else, Lisa exploded. She said her personal life was none of my business anymore and that she didn't have to answer to me about anything. She said she was finally free to make her own choices without my approval, and she wasn't going to let me guilt her into explaining herself. I tried to point out that adultery during marriage could legally affect divorce proceedings, so it actually was relevant to our case. But Lisa said that was just another example of how I used logic and rules to control people. She said I couldn't accept that she was an independent person with her own desires and needs. The call ended with Lisa hanging up on me after saying she was going to fight for every penny she deserved. I realized that the woman I'd been married to for 8 years had completely disappeared, replaced by someone I didn't recognize at all. Over the weekend, I got a call from Janet saying that Lisa's lawyer had requested a mediation session to try to resolve our differences without going to court. Janet thought it was worth trying, even though Lisa seemed pretty entrenched in her unrealistic expectations about the divorce settlement. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. I'd been dreading it for weeks, but Janet assured me we had a strong case based on the financial documentation we'd gathered. Lisa's lawyer had refused to agree to mediation terms that were anywhere close to reasonable, so we'd ended up in front of a judge. I arrived at the courthouse early and met Janet in the hallway outside the courtroom. She reviewed our key points one more time and reminded me to stay calm and stick to the facts if I was called to testify. Lisa arrived about 10 minutes later with her attorney, a younger guy in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in aggressive tactics. When our case was called, we all took our seats at the appropriate tables. The judge, an older woman with reading glasses, reviewed both filings before asking Lisa's lawyer to present their position first. He launched into a speech about how Lisa had sacrificed her career ambitions to support my teaching career and deserved compensation for her contributions to our marriage. He claimed that Lisa had been financially dependent on me by design and that I had discouraged her from pursuing better employment opportunities. He argued that she needed substantial spousal support to get back on her feet and establish her independence. When he finished, the judge asked him several pointed questions about the length of our marriage and Lisa's work history. Then it was Janet's turn to present our case. She methodically went through our financial records, showing that most of our major assets had been acquired with premarital funds or through my sole income. She demonstrated that Lisa had chosen to work part-time and had actually turned down full-time opportunities when they were offered. Janet also presented evidence of Lisa's social media activity, including photos and posts that suggested she was already in a relationship with Derek. She argued that Lisa's claims of financial dependency were contradicted by her apparent ability to maintain an active social life and new relationship while supposedly being unable to support herself. The judge asked Lisa to testify about her employment history and future plans. Lisa took the stand looking nervous but determined. She explained that she'd worked part-time because I had preferred her to be available for household responsibilities. She said she'd wanted to go back to school, but that I had discouraged her from taking on debt for education. When Janet cross-examined Lisa, she asked about the art classes Lisa had mentioned wanting to take. Lisa admitted that I had actually encouraged her to enroll and offered to pay for them, but she said she'd felt pressured to choose a program I approved of. Janet then asked about Lisa's current relationship status. Lisa's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question since adultery could affect spousal support determinations. Lisa reluctantly admitted that she was seeing someone but claimed it had started after we separated. Janet presented evidence from social media posts that suggested the relationship had begun earlier, but Lisa maintained her timeline. The hearing lasted about 3 hours total. When both sides had finished presenting their cases, the judge said she would review all the evidence and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt emotionally drained but also relieved that the hearing was over. Janet seemed confident about our chances, but she warned me that judges could be unpredictable and we shouldn't assume anything until we got the written ruling. Lisa and her lawyer were having what looked like an intense conversation near the courthouse steps. I could see that she was upset about something, probably how the hearing had gone. Her lawyer seemed to be trying to manage her expectations, which made me think maybe he was finally realizing that her demands had been unrealistic from the start. I thanked Janet for her work and headed home to wait for the judge's decision. The next 2 weeks were some of the longest of my life. I tried to focus on my teaching and maintain some kind of normal routine, but it was hard to concentrate on anything else. During that time, I did a lot of thinking about my marriage and what had gone wrong. I wondered if Lisa's accusations about me being controlling had some truth to them, even if I hadn't intended to be that way. Maybe I had been too involved in her decisions or too quick to offer solutions when she just wanted support. But I also realized that Lisa had never communicated any of these concerns to me during our marriage. If she'd felt stifled or controlled, we could have worked on changing those patterns. Instead, she'd apparently been building resentment for years while planning her exit strategy. I felt guilty about the failure of our marriage, but I also felt angry about how Lisa had handled the situation. Filing for divorce without warning, making unrealistic financial demands, and then accusing me of being vindictive for responding legally seemed unfair and manipulative. The hardest part was accepting that the woman I'd loved and married had either changed completely or had never been who I thought she was. Either way, that person was gone, and I needed to stop hoping she would come back and be reasonable about our divorce. I started thinking about what my life would look like after this was all over. I'd probably have to sell the house and find an apartment. I'd be starting over at 34, which felt scary but also potentially liberating. Maybe Lisa wasn't the only one who needed freedom to figure out who she really was. 2 weeks after the hearing, Janet called to tell me the judge's ruling had arrived. She wanted to review it before discussing it with me, so we scheduled a meeting for the next day. I spent that night alternately hoping for vindication and preparing myself for disappointment. The judge's ruling was better than I'd hoped, but not as satisfying as I'd expected it to be. Lisa was awarded about 30% of our marital assets instead of the 50% she'd demanded. She would receive limited spousal support for 18 months, and she was responsible for her own legal fees since her initial demands had been found to be excessive. Most importantly, my premarital assets remained separate property, which meant I could keep most of my retirement savings and wouldn't have to sell the house immediately. Lisa would get her car and about $20,000 from our joint savings account, plus the spousal support payments. Janet explained that the judge had been influenced by evidence of Lisa's relationship with Derek, which had clearly started before our separation despite her testimony to the contrary. The judge had also noted that Lisa's claims about being prevented from working full-time were contradicted by her employment history and her own admissions during cross-examination. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I just felt empty. Winning a legal battle against my wife didn't feel like winning anything meaningful. It just meant that our marriage was officially over and we could both move on with our lives. Lisa's reaction to the ruling was predictably angry. She called me that evening and accused me of manipulating the legal system to punish her for wanting independence. She said the judge had been biased against women and that I'd probably lied about encouraging her career development. I tried to explain that I'd just responded to her legal demands with equally valid legal arguments. But Lisa said I was still trying to control the narrative even after our divorce was finalized. She said she never wanted to speak to me again unless it was absolutely necessary for legal reasons. After that call, I realized that Lisa was going to blame me for everything that had happened, regardless of the facts or the judge's ruling. She needed to see herself as a victim of my controlling behavior rather than acknowledge that she'd made unrealistic demands and handled our separation poorly. I decided to accept that this was how our marriage was going to end, not with mutual understanding or even friendly disagreement, but with Lisa convinced that I was the villain in her story. It was sad, but it was also liberating to stop trying to change her mind or get her to see my perspective. The divorce was finalized about a month later with minimal additional drama. Lisa moved in with Derek officially, and I started the process of rebuilding my life as a single person. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted for our marriage, but it was the ending we'd created together through our choices and actions. Epilogue. 6 months later, I'm living in a small apartment across town and honestly feeling better than I have in years. Teaching is still going well, and I've started coaching the debate team, which gives me something productive to focus on outside of work. I've been dating a little bit, nothing serious yet, but it's nice to remember that there are women out there who communicate directly about what they want instead of building secret resentments. I heard through mutual friends that Lisa and Derek broke up about 3 months after our divorce was finalized. Apparently, he wasn't as interested in a serious relationship as she'd thought. She's back to posting cryptic social media messages about finding herself and learning to be independent. I don't check her profiles anymore, but sometimes people tell me things whether I want to hear them or not. Looking back, I think Lisa genuinely believed she was trapped in our marriage and that I was somehow preventing her from being her authentic self. But I also think she confused having a partner with losing her independence, and she never learned how to communicate her needs effectively within a relationship. Her demand for freedom was really a demand to avoid the compromises that make marriages work. I'm not bitter about it anymore, just sad that we couldn't figure out how to be married to each other successfully. Maybe we were just incompatible in ways that weren't obvious until the relationship was under stress. Either way, I'm glad the legal drama is over and we can both move forward with our separate lives.